Dr. Buffano coming at you with another lecture on Middle East politics. In today's lecture, we're going to continue our discussion on different types of dictatorships in the Middle East. And specifically, we're going to talk a lot about monarchies. In fact, this is the first part in a two-part lecture talk on monarchies within the Middle East. And we're going to specifically focus on the Arab Gulf region. So let's get started here. All right, so most of you out there should at least have some type of idea about what monarchies are. But before we can really jump into this topic, we're going to get into a little bit of detail about how monarchies actually function. And so first, we're going to do that. We're going to discuss what these types of political systems are. And then after that, we're going to discuss specifically the monarchies that exist in the Arab Gulf, countries like Saudi Arabia, Bahrain, Qatar, the United Arab Emirates, Oman, and so on and so forth. Now, what's interesting about this is that most of the world's monarchies that still exist, most of them are found in this one region of the world, specifically this one sub-region of the Middle East. So we're going to try to find out why that's the case. Why is it that monarchies, which used to be very common throughout the world, are on the decline everywhere except in this one part of the world? And then finally, we're also going to understand some of the similarities and differences between these monarchies. So we're going to do this over the next two lectures. And of course, this is very important to understand the politics of the Middle East, since these Arab Gulf countries, they got a lot of oil wealth, they got a lot of political power. So let's get to it. All right, this term monarchy, you might notice within the term itself the word mono, which means one. An archy means rule by, specifically rule by a single person or family, right? So one of the oldest forms of political organization in the world, dating back to the days of ancient Sumeria. Now, the way these systems work is first, the person in charge is usually there for life, okay, until they die, whether it's by natural causes or, perhaps by murder. They're there until they pass on and move on. And of course, what happens in these systems is once the monarch dies, the king dies, power then passes down to someone else within the family. Usually it's the case that it'll pass to perhaps the eldest son or the eldest male relative, although this can differ from monarchy to monarchy. And at various points in time, because of palace intrigue, sometimes the designated successor can get murdered or get pushed aside in favor of somebody else, right? So sometimes there can be succession crises within these political systems. It's one of the challenges that monarchies face. Now, within these regimes, the importance of bloodline is paramount. It's critical. These regimes often make certain claims about the ruling monarch. Perhaps the monarch has some type of special blood. Maybe they're divinely blessed by God. Maybe they claim that their family has some sort of special history, or perhaps the family itself will gloat about its past exploits. Whatever the reason, they usually place a lot of importance on bloodline. And you also have within these societies as well this common belief that bloodline matters. Often there's an aristocracy, there's an important group of different families that claim to be greater than all of the other families in that society. And thus, intermarriage is important here. Usually the monarch's family will have strategic alliances and marriages with important families, whether these families are important economically, perhaps they're great landowners or business owners, or perhaps their families are important religious scholars and religious leaders that they will intermarry with. Now, the key here with a true monarchy is the monarchy isn't just symbolic in true monarchies. In other words, the monarch has to have real, actual power. The monarch has to actually run the executive branch, okay? They control the bureaucracies that collect taxes, that enforce laws, that run the military. They are involved in governance directly. Now, this is very different from, say, the monarchy that currently exists in Great Britain. Great Britain today is a democracy. It's a parliamentary democracy. And the job of the monarchy there is to act kind of like a mascot, right? They're there to wave to the crowds, to give speeches, but they don't have actual governing power. They're kept around for tradition. Real power in Great Britain is with their parliament, their legislature. But in a true monarchy, the monarch actually rules. And of course, this was the case for most of human history, right? In terms of, agricultural-based civilizations, they usually had monarchical rule. And these regimes, for most of history, relied on what's called traditional legitimacy. We tended to find them historically in places that, had agricultural-based economies where most people lived as peasants and most people were illiterate. They didn't have a good education. And the legitimacy itself was founded often on the fact that these monarchs, some ancestor way back in the past conquered some piece of land and created the monarchy. And their legitimacy as well often relied on religiosity, right? Having some sort of ties with important religious institutions. So think of, for example, about the medieval monarchs within Europe, such as France's medieval monarchy. The French monarchy had a lot of its legitimacy tied to its ties to the Catholic Church within the country, for example. So these monarchs, they're usually backed by the religious establishment. They protect the religious establishment, and then the religious establishment gives them the divine blessing to rule. So where are monarchies found today? Let's take a look at this map here. Now, as you can see here, almost no countries out there have monarchies. And the few that do have monarchies that have no actual power. If you look at these colors here of light yellow and blue, these are countries that have symbolic monarchs, like Great Britain, right? So Great Britain, Canada, Australia, Spain, Belgium, the Netherlands, their monarchs don't have actual power. Now, there are a few exceptions to the rule here. If you notice in this color red here, these countries have actual monarchies. Now, notice outside of the Middle East region, we find almost no monarchs that actually rule. So within the Middle East, we have here in the Gulf region where we find just about all our monarchies. So Saudi Arabia, Kuwait, Bahrain, Qatar, the United Arab Emirates, and Oman. We also have here this country of Jordan and Morocco. We're not going to talk about these two monarchies today. We're just going to focus on the Arab Gulf. So why are monarchies so rare today? Well, a lot of it has to do with modernization and economic development, right? Over the last 2 centuries, the world has witnessed a tremendous amount of economic growth. People have moved to cities, countries have industrialized, the emergence of mass communication has taken place, mass education. Citizens are better educated, more well connected, and wealthier than they used to be. And so it's much more difficult for single families to dominate entire societies. Governance has also become more complicated. It's less acceptable now to have one ruling family dominate an entire government, right? So you can't possibly have members of one ruling family being qualified to run the IRS, to run the public healthcare sector, to run the military. So in today's world, merit and science are important, and thus the legitimacy for monarchy has eroded. Now, the question then becomes, why do we have monarchy in this one part of the world so prominent, the Arab Gulf? And that's what we're going to get into in the next 2 lectures. Very fascinating question. All right, so monarchies in the Arab Gulf. Okay, these are the Arab Gulf states here. I've listed out Kuwait, Bahrain, Qatar, the UAE, Saudi Arabia, and Oman. So what do they have in common? What makes this a kind of sub-region of the Middle East? Well, several things. Number one, of course, they're all monarchies, and thus they're authoritarian regimes. So there is a ruling family in each of these countries that controls the bureaucracy. Now, there's also something else these regimes have in common, and part of the reason why these monarchs can continue to exist. All of these countries have very small populations with a ton of oil wealth, okay? They are swimming in oil. And because of this, these countries have not had to invest in modernization in terms of industrialization in order to bring about development and to create a standard of living for their citizens that gives them a modern standard of living, right? So these countries have been able to raise the standard of living for their citizens and provide them access with housing, running water, all of this great stuff, but without having to invest in modern education or industry. So as a consequence of this, oil has enabled these countries to bring about development for their citizens. And on top of it, because oil is a really easy resource to control, it has made it easy for very simple dictatorships to maintain their authority. So that's part of it. Now, part of it as well, as you're going to find out in a second, is that all of these countries have the strong backing of Western countries. Initially, the British, and later, after World War II, the United States has come in to really protect these countries from outside competitors. And thus, they haven't had to develop a very competent state based on meritocracy, right? So they haven't had to really develop their true military capacity to actually defend their borders in a way that a lot of other countries throughout the world have, because they can rely on the United States to do that for them. Now, this is not to say these governments don't spend a lot on their states, but there's a lot of corruption and misuse of resources that flows into the bank accounts of these different monarchies. So they're dependent on oil and Western military support. They haven't had really to invest in industrial development. And on top of that as well, they haven't even had to educate their own population to build that oil infrastructure, right? They haven't really had to rely on training their own engineers. They have been importing a lot of the workers to do the dirty work for them. Right. So they import a lot of well-educated workers from the West and East Asia, as well as a lot of really blue-collar workers from different parts of the Middle East and other parts of the Islamic world to do the dirty work for them. So lots of guest workers here. Now, because they haven't had to invest in really the kind of modern educational development that a lot of states have, they have been able to continue to promote conservative, traditional religious values. And this has enabled the monarchies to maintain their legitimacy. And on top of that, Saudi Arabia is also the home of Mecca and Medina, the site of pilgrimage. So very conservative populations continue to exist in this region of the world, some of the most conservative in the Middle East. And as a consequence as well, there's a lack of religious freedom in these places, right? So you have highly authoritarian regimes that suppress the rights of religious minorities. So these are Sunni Arab Muslim populations, and the Shia minorities that exist are severely repressed in this part of the world. And a form of Islam that we talked about in a prior lecture called Salafism dominates. So Salafists, these are individuals who are less open to change within the Islamic faith. They are more fundamentalist in nature. So this is what the Arab Gulf looked like on our map here. We've got Saudi Arabia, Kuwait, Bahrain, Qatar, the UAE, and Oman here, as you can see. And so notice how all of these countries, they're located on the Arabian Peninsula. So why is it that these countries never developed, they never had a defensive development period like the Ottoman Empire? Why is it that they, never industrialized? What are some of the different reasons for this? Well, part of this is explained by the nature of the Arabian Peninsula itself. As we learned in that prior lecture about Saudi Arabia, it consists mostly of desert and scattered oases. So it's very dry, very little rainfall. It's not densely populated, and there's only a few places where you can grow agriculture. And so thus, historically, this region has really been marginalized. Outside of what happened in Mecca and Medina during the time of the Prophet Muhammad and the initial conquest of Islam, this really has been a region of the world that has been neglected and marginalized from other great empires. And its economy, it hasn't been able to sustain an agriculture-based civilization. Its economies historically was mainly dependent on things like animal husbandry, so goats and camels, that sort of thing. And off the coast, things like fishing and pearl diving. And these type of activities, they are not going to sustain, an agricultural-based civilization, never mind a modern industrial society. And the few instances where we do find agriculture are only a few scattered oases, such as Riyadh, Mecca, and Medina. So very little in the way of agriculture in this part of the world. In fact, before the discovery of oil, in the 1930s, it was one of the poorest regions of the world. So it's hard to imagine this today because I think when a lot of people think of the United Arab Emirates, they think of tall skyscrapers, right? They think of tremendous oil wealth. But this was not the case before the 1930s. And relative, of course, to other areas of the Middle East, such as the Ottoman Empire, the Safavid Empire, the Arabian Peninsula was very underdeveloped. So thus, its political systems were also very simple. They were based on familial connections, what we know as tribal confederations. Go watch a previous lecture of mine from the beginning of this lecture series to learn about what clans and tribes are. Essentially, a tribal confederation is a group of families that have an alliance. And of course, leadership is based on familial heritage, right? There's some families that are more powerful than others within these confederations. In Arabic, they're called sheikdoms, sometimes emirates. A sheikh is the head of a powerful family. Now, because this region was so marginalized, it was ignored by the Ottoman Empire. It was ignored by the Safavid Empire during the days of the gunpowder empires. And later, during the era of European imperialism, it was pretty much neglected, ignored by the French and the British. It was considered an area of the world that was not too important. In fact, for the Ottoman Empire, their main concern with this region of the world was just Mecca and Medina, the Hejaz region. And outside of that, the Ottoman Empire was not very much involved in the internal politics of what was going on in places like Riyadh. So during the days of the Ottoman Empire, they did conquer Mecca and Medina. They did get in various conflicts with some of these sheikdoms in order to try to control these holy cities. But outside of that, they left the region alone. Okay, and so we can see here on this image, what this region is mostly like and consists mainly of desert, the Arabian Peninsula here, with very light population densities. So within the Arabian Peninsula, we find these sheikdoms. Each of these tribal confederations, these groups of powerful families, were dominated by these sheikhs, okay? Otherwise known as emirs, okay? So a sheikh, it's a male head of a powerful family. And the way these systems worked is that, these sheikhs didn't exactly have a lot of power, right? So there wasn't much wealth to accumulate. They had to share power with their other family members, and they engaged often in what were called consultation sessions. They would sit down with the other heads of the families and discuss things that were important to these tribal confederations, such as how to distribute resources to the loyal tribe. So what few resources exist, like grazing land for goats or access to water wells, access to oases, they would distribute these lands to these different families, the different clans, and they would resolve any disputes between them. They were kind of like mediators between these different clans to try to resolve disputes, to prevent bloodshed. And sometimes if, one clan violated the rules or a member of the clan violating the rules, they would have to enforce tribal justice, right? So this might involve, executing somebody. Now, the lands controlled by these tribes, they were called sheikdoms or emirates. The word emir means prince. So these lands, they were controlled by these tribal confederations. And on top of it as well, these tribal confederations also did have to underpin their legitimacy with Islam. These tribesmen were Muslims, and so they supported the families that were involved in maintaining mosques and, enforcing Sharia law, religious laws. So there were Islamic judges, okay, that would enforce Sharia law amongst these tribesmen. And so they had very strong alliances with the Sunni Muslim ulama, the religious clerics. So, for example, we talked about in a previous lecture how the Saudi royal family had a strong relationship with the Wahhabi ulama, the Salafist ulama within Saudi Arabia. That alliance began in the 18th century. And so this gave these sheikdoms religious legitimacy. They would protect these ulama, and in exchange, the ulama would bless them with religious legitimacy, with their loyalty. So these are the different monarchies that exist in the Middle East. Most of them emerged from the 18th to the 19th century, the ones that exist here today. So here's Saudi Arabia is ruled by the Saudi. family. The regime in Kuwait is ruled by the Al Sabah family. And we have a bit of a different situation in the United Arab Emirates. It's actually a federation of seven different emirates, seven different sheikdoms, with each ruled by its own ruling family. So, for example, the largest of these emirates, which is Abu Dhabi, is ruled by the El Nahyan family. You also have here in Qatar, so this is ruled by the Al Thani family, and so on and so forth. Each of these different countries in the Arab Gulf are still ruled by a royal family. So very prominent political system in this region of the world. And the way it works in all of these systems is that you're born into power. If you're born into the most powerful family within these sheikdoms, you become the new king, okay? You become the new leader, the new emir, the new sheikh of these polities. So, for example, one of the ruling families in the United Arab Emirates is the Al Maktoum family. They rule over an emirate called Dubai. And this is, so the Maktoum family has been ruling this emirate for several centuries now. And as you can see, what happens is after each generation, power gets passed down through the royal bloodline. Now, when did the West get involved in this region of the world? Why are they all protected by Western powers? Well, first things first, this region was never actually directly colonized by Europeans. We talked about this with Saudi Arabia. This is true for the rest of the region. This is very different from most of the lands of the former Ottoman Empire, which got divided up by the British, the French, the Italians, etc. Here, there was no direct colonization. However, the British did establish these very limited protectorates in the 19th century. Basically, the way these protectorates worked, the British agreed to protect the coastal emirates, the coastal sheikdoms from outside threats in exchange for these countries not attacking British shipping in the Arab Gulf and in the Indian Ocean. So these treaties were signed throughout the 1800s. So at the time, the British had this growing empire in India. They were doing a lot of trade in the Indian Ocean and in the Red Sea. And of course, after the Suez Canal got built, eventually the British would colonize Egypt. They took control of the Suez Canal in 1882. They were concerned about the shipping that was coming through this region, through the Red Sea into the Suez Canal. So they wanted to prevent piracy off the coast. So their only concern with the Arabian Peninsula is they didn't want any pirates operating off the coast. So the British made an agreement with these sheikdoms. They agreed to not attack. They agreed to protect their sovereignty. In exchange, these sheikdoms said, we are not going to attack any of your ships, and we'll crack down on piracy. Now, what did these sheikdoms get out of this? Well, they got from the British protection, and most of these sheikdoms were very worried at the time in the 19th century about the growing power of Saudi Arabia. The most powerful of these different kingdoms was the Saudi kingdom, based in Riyadh. And as their power grew throughout from the late 18th to the early 20th century, they were very worried, the emirs of Kuwait and Qatar and Bahrain, that they would be swallowed up by the Saudi family. And so the British said, hey, look, we'll protect you from Saudi expansion. So one by one, they form these treaties with the British, and the British establishes naval bases off their coast. And this served to protect these little emirates. So one great example of this is the United Arab Emirates. Otherwise, it was originally known as the Trucial States. Trucial just means coastal. These seven little emirates decided to form this federation to protect themselves initially from Saudi Arabia. And then they signed this agreement with the British to protect themselves. So this confederation continues to exist. And the way it works is there are these seven different kingdoms that form a single country. Each of the kingdoms have some autonomy over their internal affairs. So it's like a federalist system, control over taxation and local infrastructure. But they have a central government with a military, and the president, and I put president in quotes, of this confederation is always the king of Abu Dhabi. And they signed this protectorate with Great Britain in 1820. And in fact, all the way up until 1971, they were protected by the British Navy. So they liked this agreement very much because the British didn't really get involved in their internal affairs in the same way the British and French often did in their other colonies. So very much a hands-off policy here. So here are these British protectorates that were established on the coast of the Arabian Peninsula. So we could see here our Arab Gulf countries, these coastal sheikdoms, Kuwait, Bahrain, Qatar, the United Arab Emirates, Oman. They also formed a protectorate with southern Yemen, this place called Aden, here the city of Aden. They wanted to make sure the shipping throughout this region was not molested by pirates. And by the way, this is what Abu Dhabi, I'm sorry, the United Arab Emirates looks like. We see here these seven different sheikdoms here, the seven emirates. So we have Abu Dhabi, Dubai, Sharjah, Ejman, Al Quwain, Fujairah, and Ras Al Khaimah. The most powerful, as you can see, just based on territory, is Abu Dhabi. It's where most of the country's oil is located today. And the second most powerful is Dubai within this federation. Now, eventually, the British are going to get replaced by the Americans a little later in history. Of course, as you learned earlier in the semester, British power declined by the end of World War II, right? And the Americans are going to emerge as the most powerful country in the quote unquote Wests. In fact, the British, because of their declining empire, eventually they had to end all their protectorates by 1971. Throughout the 1960s, they gave up each of these countries. They had to give them their official independence one at a time. And so what happened is the United States stepped in to become the protector of these various emirates. So the first U.S. military base was established during World War II in Bahrain in 1944. And then from there on, they would establish other military bases throughout these different kingdoms. And it only increased over time, especially after the British left in the 1970s. And then in 1990, when Saddam Hussein invaded Kuwait, the United States sent in this very large force with other countries in the United Nations to kick Saddam Hussein out, and then American military presence increased there further. So, with the United States kicking Saddam Hussein out, these Arab Gulf countries continue to believe that they really relied on Western powers to protect them. These little countries with small populations, they are outnumbered greatly by countries like Iran, Iraq, and so they're very worried about their security. Now, why is it that the United States grew so interested in these countries in the middle of the 20th century? Well, for reasons we discussed in an earlier lecture with Saudi Arabia, it's because of their concerns about the region's oil resources. See, the Arab Gulf has about half of the world's oil resources. They don't want this falling into enemy hands. And in fact, it was seven different American and British oil companies known as the Seven Sisters, the largest of which is now known as ExxonMobil. They helped build up the oil industry in this part of the world. And so we could see here, most of America's military bases is located in the Arab Gulf. Today, the United States has thousands of troops stationed there to protect these countries from outside aggressors. So these states haven't really had to defend their own sovereignty throughout their history. Now, of course, why is it that the U.S. considers this region so important today? Well, it was the discovery of oil in the early 20th century that suddenly turned what was one of the poorest regions of the world into a very wealthy region of the world. Oil was first discovered in the early 20th century in the Arab Gulf countries in the 1930s. And so it is Western oil companies that actually pulled the oil out of the ground. So these monarchs didn't even have to do the job themselves, right? So they're putting very little work into gaining their wealth, right? They didn't have to invest in their own infrastructure or educate their own populations to get wealthy. In fact, so here, Bahrain, the first country, started to export oil in 1934. Then we get Saudi Arabia in 1938 with the discovery of their oil. So this is just a few years after the modern borders of Saudi Arabia finally consolidated in 1932 under the rule of the King Abdulaziz. And then Kuwait, a few years later in 1946, oil is discovered there. Qatar in 1949, and the United Arab Emirates in 1962, and finally Oman in 1967. So one at a time, these countries discover oil. And so, of course, these Western oil companies at the time, they were going to different parts of the world looking, speculating, looking for access to oil resources. At the time, oil was becoming ever more important for the economies of the world due to the invention of the combustible engine in the late 19th century and the invention of automobiles, aircraft, and of course, oil starts to run our factories. It starts to run the modern economy of the 20th century. And as countries were growing throughout the world, there's greater demand for these resources. And thus, the Arab Gulf is going to become strategically important here. And as demand for oil grows, the price of oil is going to skyrocket throughout the 1960s and 1970s, especially after 1973. So initially, it is Western oil companies that had the advantage here because they were pulling the oil out of the ground. And a lot of these countries were still not fully independent from Great Britain in the 1950s. Initially, it was Western oil companies and the West setting the price for how much they would pay these Arab Gulf countries for their oil. However, as the Arab Gulf countries gained their independence, they began to press for a change to this relationship. They wanted more access to oil revenue. They also wanted oil prices to go up. So in 1960, these countries begin to work together and they eventually formed this organization called the Organization of Petroleum Exporting Countries, OPEC. Now, what is this organization? It's a cartel. What the countries do within this organization, these are countries that have a lot of oil, is they can agree to reduce the global supply of oil to get the price up. In other words, they could stop producing some of their oil so that the price of oil then will rise, right? If you reduce the supply, this makes oil more valuable. People are willing to pay more for it. So the idea of doing this is twofold. A, it could put more money in the pockets of these countries. And B, it could also be used as a political weapon, right? To increase the political power of these countries, to place pressure on the West and other parts of the world to, in negotiations over various issues. And one example of this is what happened in 1973. So during the 1973 war, we learned about this in a prior lecture. I recommend going back to that discussion on the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. During the beginning of that war, Anwar Sadat in Egypt and the Assad family in Syria, they had this sneak attack in Israel, right? So during the holiday of Yom Kippur and Ramadan, they invade Israel. There was a war that lasted for several weeks. And in the process of that, the Arab Gulf states decided to enact an embargo on the selling of oil to the West, particularly in response to the United States' support of Israel during that war. So the idea was to pressure the West to force the Israelis to the negotiation table with Arab states like Egypt. So that was the idea behind the embargo. Okay, and the embargo, for the most part, worked. It created a lot of panic in Western stock markets. In fact, there was a bit of an overreaction to it. There was a shortage of oil. There was long lines at gas stations. The price of oil went up. And in the process, Sadat was able to use that in Egypt to negotiate with the Israelis. We talked about the Camp David Accords earlier in the year, and we talked about how he got the Sinai back. So, of course, there are limits to this weapon, though, right? Once the Arab Gulf states did this, Western countries did begin to look for alternative resources to use for their energy, as well as to find other oil reserves in different parts of the world to diversify their access to energy. But in the meantime, in the 1970s, the price of oil skyrocketed. It went up quite a bit. So what happened was the wealth of these Arab states grew. In fact, I highly recommend reading this article on energy policy here. You can pause the video and look at the link. So this is the 1973 oil crisis, three crises in one, and the lessons for today. Very good article. I highly recommend checking it out. So I think a lesson we learned from this crisis is, for many countries in the world, the importance of diversifying your resources. Otherwise, if you're too highly dependent on a small set of countries for something like oil, this can be problematic. Now, of course, for the Arab Gulf countries, this benefited them, at least in the short term, because their revenues skyrocketed as a consequence of this. So we can see here most of these countries' oil resources are located in, the Arab Gulf countries within the Middle East, with Saudi Arabia having about a quarter of the world's oil resources alone. And specifically, these resources are found in this geostrategic region known as the Persian or the Arab Gulf. Okay, so here you can see here that some of these oil resources are located on the land surrounding the Gulf. Others are located in the ocean. We find a mix of oil and natural gas here. So very valuable, very strategic region. And just from this chart here, you can see here after 1973, oil prices skyrocketed. From 1973 to 1979, oil prices rose from about $20 a barrel to over $100, meaning it became 5 times more expensive. That's a lot of revenue going into these countries' pockets. And by the way, this is what OPEC looks like today. So we see here a lot of these countries are from the Arab Gulf, but there's other oil exporting countries that are part of OPEC. So other countries in the Middle East include Iran, Libya, and Algeria, which also have a lot of oil. We also have in sub-Saharan Africa, Nigeria, Gabon, Equatorial Guinea, the Republic of the Congo, and Angola. And we also have in South America, Venezuela, and Ecuador. They are also members of this oil cartel here, OPEC. All right, so that does it for this lecture. But if you want to continue listening, part two is going to talk more about these countries in the present day. We're going to talk about how this oil has impacted the politics of these countries. And we're also going to talk about some of the similarities and differences between these countries. So until next time, I will see you later.